So, yet more, well, obvious, shall we say, Brexit news. But this time, are you prepared to potentially lose your GPS system? So, the UK's threat to launch its own version of the Galileo navigation satellite system over a Brexit spat with Brussels has one big black hole. Any alternative version is unlikely to match the value of sticking with the EU's programme. London's access to the encrypted part of Galileo, called the Public Regulatory Service, and needed by the military to guide missiles and plan operations, is emerging as a key conflict in talks over the UK's impending departure with the EU, saying that as a third country, Britain will no longer have access to such sensitive data. That prompted Business Secretary Greg Clark to warn earlier this month that the government will set up a task force to develop options for an independent satellite navigation system using the world-beating expertise of Britain's thriving space sector. The threat of a new British system to power location services for civilian use while providing a secure data signal for armies isn't causing Brussels too much sleep. To lose too much sleep. It's completely pointless, an EU official who worked on the Galileo project said of Britain's plans. It is a declaration of independence, a needless political statement. The incentive to work on a British alternative to a Galileo that would be compatible with the US global positioning system comes as the EU shuts the UK companies out of further contracts for Galileo. A backup facility for receiving military-grade data from Galileo was recently removed from Swanwick in England to Madrid. And people said we wouldn't lose jobs. And Brussels is also moving to exclude the London firm from securing public regulated service aspects of the project, according to a letter sent by the European Commission in January. The signal is very robust and is a guarantee you can navigate in times of crisis, the EU official said. Non-EU members can access the signal if they meet certain conditions, but under EU rules, security restrictions are in place for third countries that want to work on developing the project, and that excludes companies from working on military-grade aspects of the constellation. So now is the right time to start thinking about adjusting cooperation regarding the Galileo programme to the way the EU cooperates with third countries in such matters, a European Commission spokesman said. However, this puts the UK tech sector under massive risk. So the sentiment has upset London, with ministers warning that Britain's absence will delay completion of the Galileo satellite constellation. Key contracts for Galileo have been previously awarded to companies like Airbus Units, Surrey Satellite Technology, and Altruism for work in the UK. Britain already hosts Galileo monitoring stations on the Falklands and the Ascension Islands. The officials in London have underlined that both sides benefit from continued cooperation, but without reassurance that the UK industry can collaborate on an equal basis and without continued access to the necessary security-related information, the UK could be obliged to end its participation in the project, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy said. So while the UK has paid 12% of the cost of the €10 billion project, despite initially fiercely opposing its development, British companies have since secured about 15% of total Galileo contracts. Losing access to Galileo's security system contracts threatens to undermine the UK's high-tech sector and embolden other aerospace countries such as France, which will aim to procure contracts and highly skilled staff. Alexander Strickings, a researcher on space policy at the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies, said that if Britain pulls out of Galileo to go it alone, it puts future cooperation with the Paris-based European Space Agency at risk and undermines a UK target to control 10% of the global space industry by 2030. The UK space industry's annual budget is some £387 million, and 289 million of that goes to the European Space Agency, meaning that British officials would need to significantly increase funding to get a system in place by the mid-2020s, and as the government has boasted. However, this might not be possible, because there are already 4 global navigation satellite systems in orbit. Galileo, GPS, Russians GLONASS, and China's Debut, I think that's how you pronounce it. So attempting to launch a 5th British version would need years of development and billions in spending to mimic those already in place. Christopher Newman, a professor on space policy at Northumbrian University, said that talking of creating a British indigenous system would be a last resort rather than the first response in talks over Galileo. A deal on continued membership would be substantially cheaper. There is so much more the UK could spend its money on in terms of space activity rather than replacing something we have already invested heavily in. The aspirations to build a spaceport in Cornwall wouldn't help any rival to Galileo much either, as satellites of the kind needed to provide navigational signals are best launched from sites near the equator, like the EU's facility in Kourou in French Guiana. Britain is already playing its cards well in negotiating this with Brussels by saying, fine, we'll do our own version. But Bledley Blowen, a lecturer on space policy for the University of Leicester, said that this is just not a believable option. A low-cost alternative could be to develop an augmentation system like those being developed by Japan and India, and the European Geostationary Navigation Overlay Service, used in the EU already to augment GPS, the EU official said. That would boost existing signals using a modest satellite presence and a network of ground-based facilities, possibly from sites across the UK's overseas territories and Crown dependencies. The UK already hosts facilities for the EU as part of this system too. However, the global coverage for a full GPS-style navigation system requires at least 18 satellites, and Galileo is set to have 13 orbit, eventually including backups. Depending on an augmentation network stretching from the Falklands Islands to Bermuda, it could rely on just 2 satellites. So, straight away, Britain is, and as you can see, no one knows about this. None of these ministers have any clue or any idea what's going on. And bear in mind, I don't think this was even brought up. I can't even remember this being talked about prior by the Leave campaign saying, oh, we'll make our own satellite version. I think they were pretty adamant, but then again, they weren't even clear on science funding. They'll just be, oh, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. No, it'll be fine. We'll lose all this, large amount of money we have access to, and it'll be fine. It'll be fine. It's like, guys, you had no plan. Just admit that, and just admit that maybe we actually need the EU more than you're prepared to admit.